Well, as we understood it, and Alan was approached in his capacity as leader of the Manx Chuff project, although of course he is the secretary of our branch as well now. Um, it was to be an amphibious assault on the Langness Peninsula. And as far as we can ascertain, and I haven't seen the full emails because Alan, of course, has been away in the Canaries on a bird watching exercise. It was to avoid the SSI, the area of special scientific interest, but we had concerns that that would be difficult given the sort of geography of the area. And the other thing was, of course, that as it looked as if it was going to coincide with Exercise Joint Warrior, which doesn't start until the end of this month, early April, in fact, it would be well into the nesting season. That's an important area for wildlife generally, but particularly for the Chuff and the Chuff project.
You've mentioned that bigger exercise which is taking place sort of multinationally. Fairly expansive scale, I'm led to believe.
Yeah, these exercises are held twice yearly, and they involve NATO countries, every NATO ally, indeed, from as far away as Turkey on occasion. And they've been ramped up in recent years because of the increased tensions between NATO and the Russian Federation. Celtic League oppose military activity in the Celtic countries. We have done so for decades now, since the 1970s. And we find it a bit galling, to be perfectly honest, that areas off the Celtic countries, like Pembrokeshire, which will be used in this exercise, Cape Wrath in the north of Scotland, and indeed the Isle of Man, which was looked at as a potential location, are thought to be desirable. And yet most of these host countries, including the United States, have been forced to drop exercises at home because of local opposition from people. So it seems like they think this is a sort of peripheral playground on the edge of Europe, which they can use at their discretion. Well, certainly the Celtic League are opposed to that.
Specifically for Langness as an instance, what's the appeal, I suppose? Why was that ever touted?
I can't understand. I mean, we campaigned about exercises in the past. Of course, there was a military camp here at Derby, and there was the bombing range off the northwest coast. So we campaigned against that, and at that time, certainly areas on the island were used. The Airs was used, and there was environmental damage there. And give the MOD their due, they recognised that, and they structured exercises outside, particularly off the nesting season, for some of the rarer types of bird up there. But eventually they pulled out of the island. The range closed, the NATO range, and eventually military exercises ended. Coincidentally, because there was a lot of popular opposition to them after an urban exercise, as I recall, in the south of the island. I can't understand why an area like Langness was thought to be appropriate. I saw in one of the emails that there'd been liaison between the Speaker of the House of Keys and the MOD. I found that peculiar as well, because generally, from my dealings with the government and the MOD, in the past over the military situation in the Isle of Man, things like that would have been handled by what's now the Cabinet Office and the Chief Minister's Office, rather than dealing with Tynwald. It's a bit like, if I could use an example, John Bercow having discussions with the French military about using the Isle of Wight or something like that. It seems a bit absurd to me.
And the concerns then, specifically to Langness, but also from previous exercises, sort of two-pronged, or that's the impression I get. It's about the environment and the ecosystem of the area, but it's also, as you said, sort of more on principle about military exercises being held on the island.
Yeah, I mean, let's be blunt. I'm not going to dress this up that we're eco-warriors, if you'll forgive the pun, and we're out to save the environment. We are opposed to military activity in the Celtic countries. But by the way, that isn't opposition simply to the United Kingdom. we've campaigned about French bases in Brittany, which is a heavily militarised area. So our opposition is fundamental. We're not opposed to defence forces, and certainly I'm very supportive and have been for many years in both the role of General Secretary and Assistant General Secretary of the role of the Irish Defence Forces in humanitarian and international peacekeeping. And if the United Kingdom's defence forces were purely that, and weren't in instances targeted as aggressors, as sadly they have been, certainly in the last couple of decades, it would be a different situation. But no, we're fundamentally opposed to military activity in the Celtic countries. And one of the good things this has done, actually, because we thought that the military presence in the island was a thing of the past, it's woken us up to the fact that it could come back again, and we'll certainly ramp up our campaign, not just here, but in the other Celtic countries as well. And by the way, that includes recruitment. And the other aspect which this has focused my attention on is the fact that the RAF use Ronaldsway on occasion for military training of Hawk jet trainers from Anglesey. Now, sadly, that base also hosts personnel from the Royal Saudi Air Force that are and have been engaged in aggressive activities in places like the Yemen and have slaughtered hundreds and injured thousands of civilians. So that's the sort of thing that really the Isle of Man shouldn't be associated with, despotic regimes like that using facilities in the Isle of Man.
Monitoring military activity is something that the Celtic League has done in years previous. I guess are incidents like this more cause for doing so, or for continuing to do so?
Well, it reminds us. I mean, there was a great hiatus. We ran a campaign which coincidentally started here in the mid-70s, but then became it involved a group called the AMA, the Anti-Militarist Alliance, but it became Celtic League policy in 1980. But there was a sort of downscaling of that in the mid-90s, because at that time the Cold War had ended. There was a great hope that there would be a peace dividend. Coincidentally, but unrelated, the situation in Northern Ireland had also resolved itself. So there was a real downscaling of military activity. And what had been for us a pretty frenetic campaign, because in those days, if I can go back to the 70s and 80s, there was no internet, so you had to rely on more basic forms of communication and have people on the ground who were prepared to do work for you. We were able to cut back on all that, and Celtic League is a small organisation. It's reasonably well funded, reasonably well supported, but we were then able to target on some of what people would regard are more traditional areas like the culture, language and so on, and we were happy to turn away from a problem we thought had gone away. This reminds us that perhaps it is an issue that's important. Certainly from the point of the Celtic League, because we're now also a recognised non-governmental organisation of the UN, we're very cognizant of views that the UN take on the activity of the military, and if you like, there the United Kingdom is in the frame because it still recruits children at an age which the United Nations regards them as being children. That's below the age of 18. So there's an anti-recruitment element in it as well. And we cooperate with other groups in Wales and in the United Kingdom generally on that.